Please welcome from the Dry Branch Fire Squad, Ron Thomason.
So it was not a shock when he passed away a couple weeks ago. It was well expected, and everybody knew it was coming, but it was still sad. In the band that I was in, everybody that was in that band with Ralph is now in the Hall of Fame except me. And sadly, all but Ralph were put in there posthumously. So I'm not in a hurry. uh, in that band, I'll start here, but I want to include a lot of people because I imagine there's people that would really like to know about that great man. From somebody that did travel with him, and from somebody that he kind of took in. But before, I'd like to say that I got to know Ralph probably best around 61 or 62. That's a long time ago. And then I played music with him in 69 and 70, and occasionally after that whenever he needed somebody, because back when I played in Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys, we would go anywhere in the country that we could get in a 20-hour drive for between $300 and $500. It was a hard time for bluegrass musicians everywhere, but it was really hard for a person who had lost his band and his teammate. I think the best thing I could do for people of all ages is try to put the early days of bluegrass music in context. By the time Carter Stanley died, Flatt and Scruggs had already been out of business for 4 years. They had a very short career when you look at it. Carter Stanley died in December of 66, and I remember thinking, Ralph's finally going to get his wish. He's going to get to become a veterinarian because that's what he wanted to do, and he felt he had some talent at it. I think I could say with certainty that Ralph was not real sure of himself back in those days. He didn't feel he really had the talent because, as he would say many times over, he'd say, we'd talk about certain songs that the Stanley brothers would do, and he'd say, well, that's Carter's song. I don't know that song. When what he meant by it was he didn't know the words. And that's kind of the old country way of knowing whether you know a song or not, because let's face it, there's only half a dozen tunes in traditional bluegrass music, which in comparison to, say, modern bluegrass music is about a half dozen more than they have. Actual melodies. So when I got that job, I thought it was probably because I was a pretty good driver. Had some endurance, but he told me later. he said it was really because I won't go there. Actually, I'll tell you later. But the plain fact is that in those days, the Stanley brothers, when Carter passed away, had, depending on how you want to count it, and Ralph wanted to count it in his latter years as 20 years that they'd been together. That's really stretching it, because if you look back at the history of when Ralph was in the service and when Carter took some time out to play with Bill Monroe, and when Carter played with another band called Roy Sykes, and I think it might have been the Clinch Mountain Boys or something similar to that. But they did play together probably as early as 1946 on WCYB radio in Bristol. And I can honestly say, and I remember this, I was born in 44, So I'm pretty soon going to be 72 years old. But I remember like it was yesterday when I was 5 years old, because my father, who was in the Army, would drive back to our little farm in Virginia, and we would go, after he was in the Army, we actually went back there to live a lot of times. As I say, we never had electricity till I was 16. But I remember they had a car radio, and Ralph says this was impossible, but it wasn't impossible because I remember it. I remember the curve of the road. I remember the car. I remember the miracle of the radio when I first heard How Mountain Girls Can Love. And it just, as a 5-year-old, it changed my life because I had always loved music, even as a little redneck. And right up till I was like taken out of Virginia, I got to hear the Blue Sky Boys, and they were my favorites until I heard that How Mountain Girls Can Love. Got to hear Bill Monroe. By the way, there wasn't any term for bluegrass music back then. It was just considered country music. And the term bluegrass music came around, I never heard it until the middle 60s, but they give it credit to Ralph Rensler, who was Bill Monroe's agent, for creating that term somewhere in the middle to late 50s, and Ralph always rejected it. I don't think Carter ever did, and certainly in the times I got to talk to him, which were not many, he felt that what they wanted to do was play bluegrass music. His vision of Ralph and Carter Stanley was bluegrass music, but Ralph's vision was old-time country music. And there was a big shift in types of music when Carter died. And in Ralph's band, I mean. And so, and I'm always wrestling with these figures because they're so amazing. But Carter Stanley was a genius in the way that William Shakespeare was. William Shakespeare, they say, could sit in the audience of a play that he had written, and when the actors would start working on the play, he could rewrite lines for them that suited their voice and their rhythm and their texture, and it would come out in iambic pentameter and rhyme at the end. And they needed scribes. Queen Elizabeth had scribes to take those down so they could change the plays. Carter Stanley, before he was 20 years old, had already written The Fields Have Turned Brown, Lonesome River, White Dove. You could go down the line. But if you just looked at The Fields Have Turned Brown as a metaphor for a young man that went to school in a county that only had 11 grades back then, you kind of get the spirit of what Ralph saw in Carter and the intimidation of going on without somebody that could write songs like that. And I'm only telling you that to tell you this. When I got in the band in 1969, that was a living axe over Ralph's head. We would go and drive down to Jackson, Kentucky, or so many places in Kentucky we played, but I remember the first time we showed up in Jackson, and the advertisements, hatch print said, "Tonight, the Stanley Brothers." And it was so humiliating to a man who had already done everything that Ralph had done. I mean, if you think of if he'd never done anything but write Clinch Mountain Backstep, you know, he would have a mark in history, but he'd already done the tenor on more albums than any other American had recorded by that time. And that's including people like Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. Because when I joined that band, I had a complete collection, all except for one album. I didn't have the second Mercury album. And, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, the name escapes me right now. So there came a time when we went into a festival, and Ralph didn't have it either because his mother's house had burnt down, so he didn't have any albums. He was still trying to collect the Stanley Brother albums, and people would come up and they'd sell them to him. I wish I could remember the title of this. Anyways, I wanted it from my collection, and so I was selling records one day, and a guy came up and flopped a copy of it down. And he said, "Would you see it, Ralph gets this?" I only admired the man so much, but I admired him enough I gave him that album. And then when another one came along, he saw that I got it. That's the kind of person he was. And I'll just say a couple more things, and then I'll take questions or whatever you'd like for me to do, because I'm still a little heartbroken over this, a little fragile about it, because I think when Ralph took me on, I was kind of in need of an adult figure in my life. I'd had it made all my life. When my dad got out of the Army, and this is not anything I deserved, but just the way happenstance works, I was playing junior high football, and they gave him a job up in Ohio so I could come play for this what ended up being a really good team. I mean, in high school, we won 3 national championships. And so they were very serious about football, and our coach had been formerly a coach of the Los Angeles Rams. His name was Lowell Storm. So I'd been spoiled on that, and never did try to learn anything in school at all. And then almost everybody on that football team got some kind of scholarship to college, so I got one. I wasn't worth a nickel. In fact, there was guys in college that would say things like, "You might want to practice that guitar a little harder, because you not only don't have a future in football, but if we ever decide to hit you as hard as we can, you don't have a future." It's like, and the coach always saying, "You got to gain more weight, you got to gain more weight." So I'm still trying to gain weight and finally learning how to do it. But so I get out there, and I could play a little mandolin and guitar, and I was really a Ralph Stanley fan and country gentleman fan. If you look back when I graduated from college, there was only 3 bluegrass festivals in the country. And within a year or two of that, there came to be about a dozen. But again, I was just spoiled. I could go to all the bluegrass festivals and try to do that now. I mean, you'd have to defy the theory of relativity, and whatever that is. And so I got to know all these people and to play a little music with Ralph. Mostly, I really got to play some mandolin with Bill Monroe. It was what a thrill, I don't know. He liked my mandolin playing for some reason, or else felt sorry for me. And he'd sit down and say, but I just hung around these guys, and one time Ralph came to this knife and gun club place in Columbus, Ohio, and was playing, and he only had 3 guys. He said, "You was playing with Bill the other night, why don't you come up and play the mandolin?" And so I did, and he said, after the show, he says, "Why don't you get your stuff and throw it on the bus?" I thought, why not? Because I was the only person that didn't have any responsibilities. I didn't have nothing. I mean, what was I going to do? I figured the place I was renting, they'd figure out at the end of the month I wasn't there anymore. And I was a really primitive redneck that knew nothing. For one thing, and I'm very ashamed of it, I didn't know manners. And I learned those from Ralph Stanley. And I've had people call me into question since, and I resent it, because Ralph might have not known formal manners, but anybody that ever met him knew it. He took the time to be polite. And I'm going to tell you now, that's what I'm kind of leading up to. That was the hardest work he did, not because he's not polite, not because he wasn't considerate, because he was so damn shy. He was just, he couldn't stand to meet people in the best way you can think. He never, I always thought, of course, all great stars eventually become a parody of themselves. We all remember Elvis, but what else is there to do as you mature? What else is there? If you look at it from the point of view of somebody like Ralph Stanley, and everybody comes around and says, well, you're a doctor, you're a national treasure, you're a Heritage Foundation winner, you're all these things, and down inside you're afraid to meet people, you don't want to shake their hand, you just don't feel worthy of anything, then you do exactly what he did, and I thought it was brilliant, is you call yourself doctor, and you ask people in the band to come up and brag on you. And the thing about Ralph is, to him that was all funny. It was very parochial and hillbilly humor of an order that I don't think he ever understood was not taken the way he meant it out in the public, which I thought, isn't that the same thing that happened to Elvis? I mean, I'm using him as a good, bad example, but that's not wrong. You could think of many people. Almost every politician becomes a parody of himself. Every school teacher does. I don't think anybody ever becomes a school teacher because they don't like children. But they learn that. And they don't learn it from the children. They learn it from the parents and the people in the community that don't respect what they do or seem to understand how hard a work that is. I don't think people become policemen to kill citizens. I think there's some that get destroyed that far in the work. And the reason I'm bringing this up is Ralph was a great politician. He believed in it. He understood politics. He once ran for county treasurer of Dickinson County, which is like the most Republican county in Virginia, or one of them. He ran as a Democrat. He was the first person that ever taught me, and I don't mean to get political here, but since he was so political, I need to explain these things. He was the first person that taught me that you had to watch out for the people that call themselves conservatives, because they're not. And back in those days, those would have been the Democrats, and especially in Virginia, and especially the places where we played, because the Democrats were the ones that could not accept the Civil Rights Act. Nowadays, what Ralph would say, and I believe, so I may as well just say, it's the Republicans who are not conservative. I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings, but you can't go around calling yourself conservative and still want a regulation on where people should pee. They've been peeing all along. You just got to accept the fact. And you can't print $386 billion and borrow another $490 billion over one weekend and spend it before Monday, which just happened, let's remember, just about 9 years ago, and still call yourself conservative. That really ticked Ralph off. He said, my God, it's the very people that say they're against this. And he had all kind of political angst. So when I was in the band, I had to put this in context because my favorite conversations ever in the world for being a primitive southern redneck of the lowest order, and I was when Ralph Stanley and Curly Ray Klein would argue a long time, not argue but discuss, I guess would be a better word, we call it arguing now. Who was the greater man, Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Lincoln? And I always felt like Ralph needs to get that out there. Ralph needs to let people know what he really is. But it all went wrong. When he ran for county treasurer, the first thing that happened, of course, he took his bumper sticker out to be printed up and wanted to put it on all the cars, and he didn't notice that the guy that printed it up had him running for county treasurer. But he took it in good stride. He thought, well, teaser, because, of course, to a farmer and a rural man, he knows that the teaser is the stallion they send in to kind of tempt the mare before the real stallion comes in. He thought, and he would always drive around saying, well, if I can only be a teaser, I'll settle for that. And So I'll stop there. I could go in any direction with this because I really did know the man. I really admired him. I knew him well enough that over the years we had several misunderstandings. We would argue, and whenever we'd see each other, we were always glad to see each other. Where I live now, the upstairs bedroom's called the Ralph Stanley Suite because that's where he would come and look at the Rocky Mountains later in life. And he knew when he got there, he didn't have to play any banjo, and he didn't have to sing or anything. And so one night when he was out there, the whole band, I kept feeling like, man, I better go to sleep so he'll leave. And he just kept hanging around about 2 a.m, and the rest of the band was there, and they were drinking a few beers and whatnot. And pretty soon they all got tired and went to bed. And Ralph pulls out, he says, I wanted you to hear something. And it was that T-Bone Burnett album that had been produced just Ralph Stanley. And he said, I didn't want you to have to listen to this with the boys around. Because he'd never, ever done anything, as he said, without the Clinch Mountain Boys. He felt the Clinch Mountain Boys were what made him, in a way. And of course, he was right. Because he made the Clinch Mountain Boys those things. He gave them their vision. The whole time I was with him, which was not a long time, but a couple years, we never had a practice. The only time he ever told me what to play was when I got it wrong one day. Somebody asked him to do working on a building, and he turned around. I loved always the way he said my name was Ron. I mean, it had like 3 syllables in it. I actually started spelling it, R-A-W-H-N. He turned around, we were on the stage at Berryville, and he said, well, Ron, you know the kickoff to working on a building? And of course, I knew Bill Monroe's kickoff, but I hadn't separated them. So I kicked it off, and he goes up there, and he just says, wait a minute, boy. I think Ron thinks we're playing Orange Blossom Special. So after it was over, he said, I want you to hear the way Curly Lambert played it, and that's the way we have to play it. That's all he ever said, was try to play it the way the other guys did it. And it was nothing like what I'd played. So anything, I do have some stories, but you might want to know stuff about the great man. Rome. Yes, sir.
Did the average member of the band enjoy working with Ralph?
Yes. The plain fact is we all knew, although it was never spoken, we all knew that he was at the time, especially when I started with him, he was losing money. He couldn't keep a bus on the road. He'd sometimes get us a motel room and he'd sleep in the bus. He sometimes didn't have money to pay us with, and so he'd offer a trade. And if as far as I know, everybody just stayed along with him. And then when he had money, you got more. It was just you kind of had to. Here's the deal. This is about Curly Ray Klein mostly, but it shows what kind of man Ralph was too. There came a time when we went out for 28 days, which is a long time for hillbillies, because we're taught to love our homes from a very early time. And so much so that when my father, who was a bad alcoholic by the time, inherited my grandparents' farm, he just sold it for pennies and then drunk up the money. And he was sick. But once I had the means, I just went and bought it. I've only been back one time. But it just meant that much to have that little truck farm where my grandmother milked cows up till 2 weeks before she died. And she died about 2 weeks after my grandfather died, who'd had black lung so bad that for the last maybe decade of his life or more, he had to sleep sitting up. And that's the way people think about their homes. And so when you hear Ralph Stanley's thing about the old home place, or the fact that the funeral was held at the old home place, the fact that he was going to be buried right next to Carter at the old home place. That's a real hillbilly thing. And so it's related to this story where we'd gone out for 28 days, and in the middle of it, we played in Texas for Lyndon Johnson after he was president. And then we had to make a drive back to Washington, D.C., where we played for Richard Nixon while he was president. And so things were kind of looking up for the band. Sometimes we'd make like $1,000. And he was never a secret about what we were being paid. You know, a lot of times he'd just tell one of the band members, go get the money, because it was mostly cash money back then. So on the way back on the long drive, we'd gone back out west and played in Texas for a festival it was Oklahoma. We played in Oklahoma. Gosh, I forget these names again. I really apologize. We were coming back, and of course, we stopped in a little restaurant about maybe 80, 90 miles from Virginia, where we would park the bus and everybody'd get out and go home till we played again. So, of course, irresponsible me, no obligations in the world, we come to this little restaurant, kind of diner place, and they had a little special there. And it was, I think it was like $9.99 for a steak dinner with all the trimmings, little salad, taters, whatever came with it. All I remember is I ordered the special. Well, we'd been out on the road so long, Roy Lee Center said, and I got to tell you this because it doesn't make any sense. There were two specials. There was like a burger special for $3.99 and a steak special for $9.99. So Roy Lee, he says, I think I'll have the same thing Ron's having. And so Ralph has the same thing. George Shuffler has the same thing. And Ray, we just expected would not, because he was always very close with his money. And in fact, we used to kind of torture Ray. I love him, man, but we'd go up and throw a quarter down behind him and act like we found it. And Ray, oh my God, kept money in his sock and everything. So anyways, we were shocked. I was, at least. Maybe nobody else caught it when Ray ordered the special. And so we ate, and the waitress came around with the checks, and I never forget, Ray leans back and said, boys, they've made a mistake on mine. They got $11 and something on here. And we're all looking at each other like, oh, darn. And so he says, I'll clear it up. And he goes up, and he comes back, and he's just sad-faced. Boys, I ordered the wrong thing. And so that's all was said about it. And we get up to Rock House, where Ray jumps off the bus all the time and jumps in his truck and go home. And he jumps off the bus, leaves his fiddle, his clothes, everything else, and runs in a little grocery store. It's up at the top of that mountain. And Ralph was driving at the time. He says, what the heck? I don't, maybe he had to go to the bathroom or something. And he's in there for a long time. Pretty soon, Ray Klein comes out, whole sack full of groceries, says, boys, what do you think about me out there eating that steak and Verdi and them kids up on the hill there having to eat burgers and eggs till I get home? And Ralph turned right around and said, I got to pay you for those groceries. That's our fault. I don't think I could say any better how I admire both those men, but how he was a good man to work for, too, because he saw the need there was more important than his need. And he was always like that, always holding you up, never pushing you down. I don't think I ever once, and it was very fashionable back in those days to maybe insult a musician in your band. I don't think I ever heard that, ever, in all the time I knew him. He always built everybody up.